Hey friends, it's Sarah, and September 30th was the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, so I wanted to recommend some of my favorite books by Indigenous authors and featuring Indigenous characters to commemorate that day. So for those of you non-Canadians, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is a statutory holiday. This is only like the second year we've had it, and it was one of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, who are a commission founded to document the experiences of Indigenous individuals who had been affected by the residential school system and to recommend ways to reconcile with that. And if you haven't heard of the residential school system before, it was a state and church-run system in Canada from the 1830s all the way up to 1996 when the last school closed, that basically took Indigenous children from their families and tried to strip them of their language and their cultures. And it was cultural and literal genocide of Indigenous individuals. So this is like a really somber day. It's not a holiday to like celebrate. It's a day for non-Indigenous Canadians to educate ourselves on this past of residential schools and try and like learn how we can help advance this goal of reconciliation and making amends to the survivors, because as I said, like the last school closed down in 1996, so it's very recent past, and it was incredibly traumatic. And I am a white person. I am not an expert on this by any means. I just wanted to recommend some books that I have found helpful for educational purposes, and then also just for like uplifting the voices of like Indigenous authors as well and recommending them. I'll also leave some educational links down in the description, so if you are wanting to learn more, you can go check those out. They're going to be a lot more informational than I am. I wanted to put this video out before or like on September 30th, but life has been kind of getting in the way, and we should be reading Indigenous authors all the time anyways, so it's a little bit later than I would have liked, but here we are. It's fine. Also, the books I want to talk about are a mix of fiction and non-fiction books, and I will present them in kind of like chronological order of when they're set. So the first book that I have to recommend is Daughters of the Deer by Danielle. I talked about this book before in one of my travel reading vlogs. I will put the link up top and down below. But this is set in 1657 and 1675. So it's around this time of like the first like French colonization of Canada and the first kind of like clashing of cultures, uneasy like integration of cultures between the Indigenous people and the French colonizers. So it follows Marie as she has to marry a Frenchman after her first husband is killed, to kind of make peace between the white people and the Deer clan, which is her clan. And then 18 years later, it follows her daughter, who is two-spirit and in love with another girl, which in Marie's culture would have been celebrated, and she would have been seen as someone like very wise and to be like looked up to, whereas they live in the like white settler society and her daughter is seen as like sinful, and it's not great. But this is a really excellent historical fiction, and it's written very like simply but very beautifully, and I thought it really did a great job of capturing this kind of like sense of duty that Marie has of like she's got to repair the relations between her clan and like the colonizers, but then also later on, you know, she's trying to protect her daughter while still being very like enmeshed in this white culture now, and it's really heartbreaking and beautiful, and I highly recommend it. I should mention that all these books deal with like Indigenous issues as they relate to Canada, because that's where I'm from, and the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is a Canadian day, so I am not going to be recommending any books that center Indigenous people who live in the United States. The next book that I want to recommend is The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King. Thomas King is a very prolific writer. This is kind of a timeline of Indigenous people in North America and like more specifically Canada, and it's really interesting and informative, but it's also like really funny. He's got an incredible sense of humor, and it's a very like kind of dry sense of humor, and you just laugh as you're learning, which is always a great way to learn. Also, highly recommend, I think, if you were to like start and not know anything about like Indigenous people in Canada, this is a great place to start. It's very easy to understand and it's super engaging. So the next book I have to recommend is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. This was actually originally an article that he wrote for CBC, I believe. And you can find the article online still. It's super short. It's like 21 like one sentence things to know about the Indian Act, which was created in 1876 and is responsible for a lot of the constraints on modern Indigenous people. This is really interesting because I feel like in school we learned a little bit about the act, but we did not go super in depth, and I didn't really realize the full extent of how much like the lives of Indigenous people are constrained by it still. It's still in effect. And he also talks about why it's still in effect, and how even though it has been like harmful, there have been like some amendments to make it a teensy bit better, but it's also very difficult to just completely get rid of it because it's so entwined in the lives of Indigenous people that it's not just as simple as like, well, we'll just get rid of it, because there's so much going on with it. It's a really good kind of like follow-up to Thomas King's book, I would say, where it goes more in depth and is a little more, not quite academic, but like a little more like technical. So a good like next level of learning about Indigenous history in Canada. The next book I have is Seven Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. So this is another nonfiction book, but it is a piece of investigative journalism, almost like a true crime kind of book. In it, the author wanted to explore the deaths of 7 Indigenous teens between 2000 and 2011, who were all high school students in Thunder Bay and had come from reserves up north, because they didn't have sufficient schools up in the reserves, so they had to be like bused down to Thunder Bay, hours away from their families, and they were like boarders at like strangers' houses. They had to live with like strange families. So she wanted to investigate these deaths, as well as like systemic racism and the education and the failures of the justice system and policing in Ontario. And it is a very like moving account. It's very upsetting, and your heart just breaks for all of these students who sadly died while they were like hundreds of kilometers away from their families. It is incredibly well researched, and her writing style is so respectful of like the victims and their families, but she doesn't shy away from like calling out the issues that she sees in the system that allowed for these deaths to happen. Up next is another kind of true crime book, and that is Highway of Tears, a true story of racism, indifference, and the pursuit of justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls by Jessica McDiarmid. This book is more of an investigation into the deaths on Highway 16 in BC, which is called the Highway of Tears because there are so many deaths, especially of Indigenous women and girls. And it's like, why is this happening? How is this allowed to happen? And again, like, what are the failings of the system that goes into this? But the author also went and interviewed the victims' family members and found out how they were trying to bring justice about for these women and girls, and what kind of steps they were taking as a community to make this stretch of highway safer so that this wouldn't happen to other people. And it's especially touching because the third and final nonfiction book that I want to recommend is In My Own Moccasins, a memoir of resilience by Helen Knott. And this is a memoir, as it says in the title, but it discusses the effects of intergenerational trauma from like the residential school system, trauma from sexual violence, as well as the author's struggle with addiction. She's a very like high profile, successful woman, but she struggled with addiction, and had been like sexually assaulted, and it was really, once again, upsetting, but a very illuminating book on how people can seem so put together and so like accomplished and successful on the outside and still have all these like scars from trauma from their past, but also from like their parents and grandparents' past that affect them, and how like someone's internal life can be so drastically different from how they present outside. And it's also a really hopeful story of how she kind of like falls down back into the pit of addiction and into like harmful behaviors, but then manages to recover from that and like get out of it again. So it does have like a good hopeful ending, which is great. Up next, I have Ragged Company by Richard Wagamese, and I've read a lot of Richard Wagamese's books. I love his writing. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2017, but he has written a bunch of fiction books. He has written some nonfiction books too, kind of meditations on like the Ojibwe way of like thinking, and those also have like beautiful illustrations in them. I would highly recommend checking those out as well. This is a fiction book about a group of homeless individuals who end up befriending a like ex-journalist in a movie theater when they're like escaping from the cold, and they end up actually finding a winning lottery ticket, and they win like $13.5 million, but because they're homeless and they don't have like ID or like paper in the system, they can't claim the tickets. So they turn to their new journalist friend and are like, hey, you're a person in society who has all the appropriate papers, can you help us get this money? What I think Richard Wagamese did so well in this book was describing these four characters' pasts and how they ended up in the situation where we meet them, because they all have like very different backgrounds and they all went through really hard times in their lives, and that's obviously how they ended up homeless. But I think he also did a great job of really hitting home the fact that like despite the fact that they're homeless, they are still deserving of respect and of dignity and of being able to like make their own choices and not being patronized by people who are not homeless or assuming that the other people would know better than the main characters, like what was good for them. So just a very like touching and heartwarming book, and I think it really humanizes a group of society that is very easy to like other and to detach from if you haven't ever been in that situation before. So I think this is just a really empathetic book. Another Richard Wagamese book, which I think might be his most famous one, and he won the Canada Reads 2013 prize for it, but this is Indian Horse. It follows a kid who goes to a residential school, but then kind of discovers a talent and a passion for hockey, and how that helps him like make it through the residential school and make life more bearable. Next up is The Summer of Bitter and Sweet by Jen Ferguson. This is a YA novel, which was so good to see because there have been very few Indigenous authors in traditionally published YA novels, and there's been sort of like an uptick in Indigenous authors who have been published and that I've like seen in my bookstore job, so that's really exciting to see. But this follows a Métis girl who lives in like a small town in northern Alberta, Saskatchewan. It's a border town. I can't remember which side she lives on, but she lives up north, and she's helping her uncles run like an ice cream stand over the summer when she finds out that her biological father has recently been released from jail and is trying to get in contact with her, and she is not about that life. She does not want anything to do with him. He's been in jail for quite a while, like most of her life, and she does not want him in her life. So she's dealing with that. She's trying to help the ice cream shack stay alive, and her best friend, who kind of, him and his family like up and left their town suddenly several years ago, he's back in town now, and so she's trying to like deal with that, him back in her life too, and it's just a lot for poor Lou. It also features some demisexuality representation there, which was really excellent to see. Just like for me, because I'm in Alberta and they talk about like places that I know, I was like, oh my god, I've been there. I live there. So like that was really fun for me. And they also have like this beautiful like beading at the top of the chapters. And at the ice cream shack, they have the different ice cream flavors are just like the color, and they like change depending on like whatever they have. They make them with like local ingredients. So they have like the little headers at the chapter where they will talk about kind of like how they make that flavor of ice cream. And like that is really interesting too. It's like a really good connection with the nature around there, and it's just an all-around like excellent book. I think this was one of my best reads of the year so far, and I'm really looking forward to reading whatever Jen Ferguson puts out next. So my last recommendation is The Marrow, Thieves by Cherie Dimaline, and this is another YA book. This was actually, I think, the first YA book that I had ever read by an Indigenous author. Cherie is Métis as well, and this is actually set kind of in like a post-apocalyptic future where most people stop dreaming, and this has made them kind of like lose their minds slowly. But Indigenous people have been able to like keep dreaming, and they are then hunted for their bone marrow, which can be used as kind of a cure for the people who can't dream. So it follows Frenchie, who is a teen trying to run away from the people who are sent out to hunt down Indigenous people for their bone marrow. It follows his trials and tribulations kind of in nature, running from them and like making connections with other Indigenous people who are on the run from these hunters. This one, as you can see, has won several awards. Yeah, this one was actually so popular that the author ended up writing a sequel. She had intended this to just be like a one-off standalone, but it got so much buzz and people were like, oh, what happens like afterwards, that she ended up writing a second book. So you know it's good. It's a great like kind of sci-fi dystopian read if you're feeling that kind of thing. So those are my favorite Indigenous reads. I would love to hear if you have any other recommendations, because I'm always trying to read more diversely and across a wider range of experiences. So let me know if you've got any recommendations down in the comments. So let me know if you like this type of video, if I should be peppering in some more information if I do this kind of video again. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. I wanted to put this video out. It's exactly parsnip, couldn't have said it better myself. But this is a fiction novel. All novels are fiction. And go read.